Hello and welcome to Africa Speaks. My name is Joy Doreen Bira, and today on the show we're going to put focus on the increased arrests of journalists on the African continent, and we're going to be speaking to a number of well-known journalists across Africa to tell us more about this situation and also to delve more into the various arrests that are being made across the African continent, in Eritrea, in Egypt, in Equatorial Guinea, Uganda, and all these other countries. So the hashtag today, we are in solidarity with the Aljazeera journalists who have been arrested or who were arrested last year in Egypt. And we are also joining them in solidarity for the release. So the hashtag today is going to be Free AJ Staff. And in case you have anything on mind that you would like to share with us, that's the hashtag. And also Africa Speaks, you can reach us. Our Twitter handles are going to be displayed on the screen. But before that, let's take a look at Web City.
South Africa will go to the polls on May 7, 2014 in what is expected to be the most hotly contested elections since the ruling African National Congress ANC came to power after the first democratic elections in 1994. The elections, the fifth since apartheid ended in 1994 with Nelson Mandela being elected the country's first black majority president, will be the first in which born-free citizens can exercise their franchise. This will also be the first polls without Mandela, largely revered by the entire country as the father of the nation. This year's election comes as the second decade of democracy dawns on South Africa, with some analysts predicting that the ANC will not get an outright majority this time round. President Goodluck Jonathan has charged foreign ambassadors serving in Nigeria to do all they can to show the world the positive realities of Nigeria. Goodluck Jonathan said showing the positive realities of Nigeria to the world would in no small measure help in correcting current misconceptions and adverse misrepresentations of the country in the international community. He asked the ambassadors to use knowledge acquired to preach positive messages about Nigeria and other African nations. The International Criminal Court in The Hague has announced plans to open a preliminary investigation into alleged war crimes being committed amid the ongoing sectarian bloodshed in the Central African Republic. ICC prosecutor Fatou Bensouda made the announcement after reviewing many reports detailing acts of extreme brutality by various groups and allegations of serious crimes. In a statement, Fatou Bensouda said over the past months she has issued a number of public statements urging all groups in the Central African Republic engaged in the ongoing conflict to immediately cease the violence and warned them that those alleged to be committing heinous crimes would fall within the jurisdiction of the ICC, would be held individually accountable.
Now, in the spirit of fronting for freedom of journalists across the African continent, here is what Click looks like.
Click today shares images of journalists worldwide sharing their solidarity in the free Aljazeera staff who are being held in Egypt, and of course the other journalists who are arrested in various countries around the world.
Well, welcome to the platform, and today, like I mentioned earlier, we're going to put focus on the increased number of arrests of journalists on the African continent. And joining me in studio is Tom Rhodes, who is the representative of CPJ East Africa. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
And via Skype, we also have Mohammed Adow, that is the from Aljazeera English, and he's also going to be speaking to us about these increased arrests and what it is to be a journalist on the African continent. Thank you both for joining us. We're also expecting to be joined by Anas Arameyo Anas, that is the investigative a journalist from Ghana that I'm sure we've all heard about, or at least watched some of his stories. He's an undercover journalist. And also AbdulAziz Billow from Somalia will be joining us a little bit later on the show. Well, Tom, thank you so much for joining us. I think I'll start with you before I get to Mohammed Adow. There are places that have been described as the worst places to be a journalist in Africa. Can we just list some of the top ones?
Sure. I mean, you know, the sad truth is Egypt is now probably one of the top of the list because we have so many journalists in jail. But we shouldn't forget other countries where journalists have been jailed for a very long time, that being Eritrea. I mean, while we're talking about 20 journalists arrested in Egypt, there's probably over 20, maybe 22, 25 incarcerated without charge in Eritrea as we speak.
Right.
Maybe some of the other top ones we should mention also is Somalia, which has always had a very high rate of killed journalists, especially in Mogadishu. And then again, Ethiopia. So we're really seeing a lot of problems here in the Horn and in the north region of Africa.
Right. And why, let's look at the reasons why, you know, these countries are such a problem for a journalist to actually work in very peacefully.
To me, it seems to be a sort of a lack of tolerance towards criticism or opposition movements within the country. And you can see that kind of reflected throughout north and east. I mean, at the moment, it seems to me that any journalist who tries to cover or tries to talk to the opposition in Egypt, and mind you, the opposition is only 3 months in the opposition, before they were in power, all of a sudden you're considered a terrorist or you're considered you know, a criminal simply for taking their side of the story.
Right.
And that...
Well, and that actually does say a lot about African countries. Are we accommodative for the truth to be told? When you look at the different governments that we have across the African continent, are these governments accommodative to journalism?
I mean, it's hard to say, right? I mean, it's hard to generalize. Africa is a huge place, and each country is different. I mean, in some countries, I feel that they are a bit more accommodative, like Ghana, for example, and I'm sure our friend can tell us more about that from that region. But there are other countries where there seems to be a zero tolerance policy. And if I could add another country which I think we really need to look at closely, and it's the newest country, South Sudan. I mean, whenever I talk to my colleagues back there in Juba or elsewhere in the country, they tell me that they simply couldn't cover the other side of the story, the other side of the conflict. Because as you know, a conflict arose in South Sudan in late December.
Right. Now let's connect to Mohammed Adow, who is joining us via Skype live from Doha. Mohammed, it's good to speak to you. And the question I'm going to pose to you is Africa, you know, a worse place to be a journalist?
Well, Joy, first of all, thanks to you and KTN for your support with our staff who were detained in Egypt for almost the last 1.5 months. I would say some places in Africa, you know, are very difficult to be a journalist. As Tom was saying, you know, all those places that are being seen increasingly as the worst jailers of journalists, you know, Eritrea, Somalia, where 12 journalists were killed in just 2012 alone, and then another 7 or 8 in 2013. And then we have Ethiopia, where, you know, prominent journalists like Eskinder Nega are still in prison. So, and South Sudan, as Tom was just mentioning there, which doesn't tolerate any information, not just dissent, not just any kind of truth, but any lines coming out of the other side. That's the opposition led by former Vice President Riek Machar. So it's increasingly becoming difficult for journalists to continue to operate in Africa. Not only are they being seen as legitimate targets by some of the people involved in conflicts in various parts of the continent, but also they are quickly locked up whenever they do any stories that ruffle the feathers of authorities.
And when it comes to the situation in Egypt, I'm sure it says a lot about the rest of the other African countries. And knowing that you have covered stories in you know, different countries across the African continent, what do you pick out of the Egypt situation?
Well, Egypt is in a unique situation right now. It's trying to manage the fallout from the revolution that saw former President Hosni Mubarak leave office. There's a lot that has happened in Egypt within the short time that Mubarak has left office. Right now, it's under military rule. And I think this period is the most draconian of all when it comes to journalists and the kind of torments they face. So I feel our network, Aljazeera, has been targeted more than any other because we have got more journalists in prison than any other network across the globe. And one of the reasons why we are targeted, in my opinion, is because we have been very objective, we've been very balanced, and we have strived as much as possible to talk to the other side in the conflict or the other side of the spectrum in Egypt.
Great. Now let's connect to Robert Shivambu, who is a journalist in South Africa with Power FM. Robert, thank you so much for joining us via phone. And I would like to find out from you, is it difficult being a journalist in South Africa, or you would think South Africa is more tolerant to journalism?
Thank you very much, Joy, for having me again. I think South Africa has provided for a very healthy media environment since the birth of democracy in 1994. I would like to believe that we have one of the most vibrant media on the continent. And I attribute that to our progressive constitution, which clearly enshrines the freedom of the press and expression. Our media has been largely free and independent for the past 20 years. However, there have been some worrying things over the past 5 years. The ruling party, ANC, has been trying to reverse all this in what appears to be an attempt to protect its corrupt politicians. In its national conference in Polokwane in 2007, it took a resolution to create a media appeals tribunal to regulate the media. That tribunal was an attempt to muzzle the media. Well, that's what we would like to believe. And that has been very much strongly opposed by the civil society and the ruling and some opposition parties. So the ruling party has since backtracked on that front. But what's even more worrying was the resolution taken by the same party, the ANC, at the same conference in 2007, to come up with a law that would protect the state information. That law criminalizes the publishing of classified state information. This includes corrupt practices and maladministration of state funds. As it is now, the protection of state information is a law in South Africa. President Jacob Zuma signed it into law in December last year, despite public outrage against it. Under the law, journalists could be jailed for about 15 years for exposing classified information. So that's not the kind of a state I would like to live in as a journalist. And in 2010, again, we saw the arrest of a journalist, a very prominent journalist with a Sunday newspaper here in South Africa. His name is Zilikaziwa Africa. He was punished for doing his job, exposing former Police Commissioner Begit Delen. He spent 2 nights in jail without being charged. So the future is worrying for journalists in this country. I would like to believe that.
Great. And from your own perspective, are there times where South Africa goes a little bit extreme when it comes to how journalists should report some of these stories, especially investigative stories?
Well, Doreen, a lot of times when as I said earlier, that I would like to believe that South Africa is largely free in terms of the press, but sometimes you see politicians criticizing the media for the way we take stance on certain issues. And they forget one thing, that media organizations are not there to praise government. In fact, when we report, they should be glad that sometimes when we expose corruption, we're trying to build the country, we love the country. But you see a lot of criticism coming from the government and politicians criticizing the media for doing their job when it suits them.
Great. Thank you so much, Robert. Kindly hold the line. We'll be getting back to you shortly. Tom, from what Mohammed Adow has mentioned and what Robert has said, at the end of the day, how best can we accommodate the fourth estate in the African continent?
It's a tough question, and there's no easy answer for that. But what I think we did last Monday, might be a good example. I feel that the press itself has to show more and more solidarity with one another to push for our colleagues. That's why I was so happy about the protest that we did here in Nairobi, outside the Egyptian embassy, pushing for them to release Peter Grest and other Aljazeera journalists arrested. Because at the end of the day, any attack on a journalist is actually an attack on all of us. Because what happens to Peter Grest could, I'm sorry to say, could happen to you, or even could happen to me at some day in the future. So I think we're going in the right direction. I mean, and I also see it even here nationally in Kenya. I mean, the Kenya Correspondents Association, the Media Owners Association, the Editors Guild, etc., the Media Council, are all uniting at the moment to push against what we consider a draconian media law, and it's having an effect. So I think that's the key to the solution for the press is more solidarity and more organization.
Right. Mohammed, if you can hear me, Tom just mentioned that some of the laws are draconian, but for the countries that you have covered, I'm sure you've covered Somalia, you've covered the Democratic Republic of Congo, and so many other countries that are going through a crisis like the Central African Republic. How bad does it get when it comes to who you should talk to and who you shouldn't talk to?
Well, it depends. In every country, there are unique situations for journalists. And if you look at, for example, countries where there is active conflict going on, I think those ones are even more difficult to cover because you don't know who you're dealing with. You don't know where the danger is coming from. And there are days when you wake up in the morning and you don't know whether you're going to be alive by the time the sun sets because, you know, journalists are increasingly being seen as legitimate targets by people. And for example, in the case of Somalia, you don't really know who is targeting you. Most of these journalists who died in the last 3 years, and these are the years that most journalists were killed in Somalia. They don't know whether it's Al-Shabaab, they don't know whether it's you know, people within the government, we don't know whether they're businessmen. So you actually don't know who is going to target you. And when you don't know, you know, where the danger is going to come from, it even becomes more difficult for the journalists to perform their jobs. But every country has got its own issues and problems and nuances. There are countries where if you do not include the government's voice in any story you're covering, any controversial topic you're dealing with, then you're for sure going to face imprisonment. And I'm increasingly seeing that, yes, there are problems in Algeria, there are problems in Egypt, there are problems in other parts of Africa, but Eastern Africa is increasingly becoming one of the worst areas for journalists to operate in, because not only do you have Somalia, where most journalists are killed, you have Eritrea, which is considered the world's worst jailer of journalists, and Ethiopia next door, which is not media friendly. And then with Kenya now coming up with this draconian media bill, Uganda, we know the history there, and then South Sudan, which is not any better than Ethiopia and Eritrea. You have a really volatile region for journalists.
Right. Now let's move on and connect to AbdulAziz Billow, who is a press TV correspondent in Mogadishu. AbdulAziz, thank you for speaking to us. Tell us about being a journalist in Somalia or in Mogadishu, the capital.
Well, thank you very much for hosting me this show. Well, being a journalist in Somalia is among the most riskiest profession I can say that one can try to venture in, particularly in a country that has been in turmoil for the past 2 to 3 years. The emergence of armed groups, and not just that's not the Al-Shabaab that is an armed group. There's so many people who are armed. A gun in Somalia is very easy. Everyone can own a gun. That means putting more lives at stake. And being a journalist is the most riskiest profession in that you're supposed to go out to look for news. Generally, journalists are never liked in Somalia, that's for sure, because we tend to tell the truth. Everyone is like against whoever is giving the information out. So, the thing in Somalia is different, but since 1993, the beginning of journalists started in Somalia until today, 2014, that's almost 21 years, and there's no single happening or peaceful no people have been brought forward or answerable to the killings of journalists since 1993. That makes it worse. The state itself, Somalia, is further threatening the situation of the Somalia. Now, being a journalist again is very risky in that in the past 3 years since 2011, there's been so much killings of journalists. In 2011, at least 8 journalists were killed. In 2012, that was the worst case in Somalia, where 18 journalists were killed. 18 journalists were killed in a span of 12 months, and that's when Somalia was in the transitional period and transferring power to the Somali federal government. And in 2013, it was killed. So, by far, it's a very similar being a journalist in Somalia so far.
Well, thank you so much, AbdulAziz Billow. That is AbdulAziz Billow from Press TV, a correspondent in Somalia right there. And now let's just take a look at some of the tweets that are coming through. SVETS M1 is saying, at this point in time, what we should be looking at is freedom of press. And we have Fred Kennedy, who is saying journalism remains a dangerous profession around the world. What you read isn't ever really free. Always remember that. And well, that is one of the people who is following us on Twitter. And KBS Brian is saying regimes all over the world should recognize the importance members of the fourth estate, especially in Africa, make. And SVETS M1 again is saying intimidation to keep the flow of information relayed as minimal as possible is just what some of these governments are up to. And he goes on to say, with the demigods tag being eroded by an open society and politicians questioned, they are turning to the journalists now. And as we wind up the show, Tom, where is the green light? At the end of the day, if we demonstrate as journalists, go out in the streets and say, you know, we also have rights as journalists, and the fact that we are the fourth estate, truth is what we should be giving the society. But then at the end of the day, we are being hit back by, you know, the national governments or, you know, different countries across the African continent, knowing that each of them have their own unique situations. So where is the green light at the end of the day?
What's the solution, or what
yes.
do you see as the...
How do we push ourselves forward? How do we front our rights? And how do we front the release of the journalists who have been jailed?
I think we keep doing what we're doing, to be honest. I mean, I keep what KTN has done, and it's you know, recommendable, is promoting these kinds of efforts to push for journalists' release, etc. Like I was saying before, you know, we do need much more solidarity within the press room. But also, I think it's important, and maybe this is something that institutions like the Editors Guild, etc., should be looking into, is it's important that we also let the public know how important this job is, right? You know what I mean? There could be a day when just a lot of stories are just swept under the carpet because of fear of intimidation from whoever, you know, and self-censorship will thrive. So it's important for us as a press also to reach out to the public and let them know, look, you know, we are doing this for you. And if we weren't here, you wouldn't be able to understand the total situation and the total picture.
Great. Mohammed, Adow, your final words?
Well, I think the media, while trying to keep themselves safe from being killed, maimed, and also imprisoned by authorities, should also fight within their organizations for better resources, better pay, training to give them the capacity that they need, because we know there is a huge capacity problem and lack of resources facing journalists as well, and this is also one of the big problems. And then there is the issue of who is setting the media, the news agenda. Sometimes it's being set by the media owners, some of them, you know, people who are ignorant about the work we do. And when so much power is vested in the media owner, and he just wants to look at the bottom line and what kind of profits they will be making in the end, it puts the journalists not only under a lot of pressure, but under increasing danger. And that needs, the journalists need not only to fight for their freedom, but also the, you know, more influence and more resources and more say within the individual media houses, I would say.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mohammed Adow, for speaking to us. Mohammed Adow of Aljazeera English, talking to KTN Africa Speaks, and also in studio Tom Rhodes, who is the representative for CPJ East Africa. And also on phone, we spoke to AbdulAziz Billow Ali, Press TV correspondent in Somalia, and Robert Shivambu from South Africa, working with Power FM in Johannesburg. Thank you all for joining us on the show and for making this show very interactive. I do appreciate that. And until next week, this conversation continues online under the hashtag FreeAJStuff. It does not only apply to Al Jazeera staff. It applies to journalists across the world who are jailed in all parts in Africa, as well as Syria. You know, Syria, I think it's even much worse there. There are other countries like Uzbekistan, but well, thank you all for making it much more interactive. My name is Joy Doreen Bira. Until next Saturday, God bless.